Let's talk about one of the biggest plot holes in GTA 5 that genuinely makes no sense: the delayed death wish option. Let's break down why this is such a significant plot hole. Throughout the game, our three protagonists, Michael, Trevor, and Franklin, are constantly threatened, manipulated, and pushed around by various factions. The FIB has Michael by the throat, Merryweather is breathing down Trevor's neck, and they're all being played like puppets by Devin Weston and Steve Haynes. Yet somehow, none of these three highly capable criminals thinks of taking the offensive until they're literally backed into a corner. Think about it. These are the same guys who can rob the biggest banks, infiltrate government facilities, and pull off impossible heists. Trevor runs a successful criminal empire. Michael is a master strategist, and Franklin proves himself to be incredibly capable throughout the story. The idea that they couldn't figure out they should eliminate their enemies earlier is frankly absurd. The game shows us repeatedly that our protagonists have the skills, resources, and connections to take out high-value targets. They successfully raid Merryweather multiple times, mess with FIB operations, and even break into heavily guarded facilities. So why wait until everything hits the fan? There's no logical reason why they couldn't have executed the Death Wish plan way earlier. What makes this plot hole even more egregious is Trevor's character. Here's a guy who's known for his extreme solutions and zero tolerance for being pushed around. The notion that he would play along with the FIB's schemes for so long, especially after reuniting with Michael, contradicts his entire character. Trevor's typical response to threats is immediate and violent retaliation, yet he mysteriously holds back until the very end. The financial motivation doesn't hold up either. These guys pull off the Union Depository heist, arguably the biggest score in Los Santos history. They clearly have the means to fund a war against their enemies. The connections? They've got them. The firepower? Absolutely. The skill? Proven time and time again. Yet they spend most of the game running errands for people who constantly betray them. Even Franklin, who's supposed to be the smart, level-headed one, never suggests taking out their opponents until the very end. This is the same guy who's shown to be strategic and forward-thinking throughout the game. His sudden realization that they could eliminate all their enemies comes way too late to be believable. The game's writers created an artificial delay in the obvious solution just to stretch out the plot. It's particularly jarring because GTA 5's protagonists are portrayed as smart, capable criminals who somehow become completely blind to the most obvious solution to their problems. They've got all the tools, skills, and motivation to take out their enemies, yet they wait until they're almost killed multiple times before finally doing what they should have done ages ago. This plot hole becomes even more apparent when you consider how easily they pull off the Death Wish mission once they finally decide to do it. If they could coordinate such a complex series of assassinations so effectively at the end, there's absolutely no reason why they couldn't have done it sooner and saved themselves a lot of trouble. Into another major plot hole in GTA 5 that really doesn't add up: Michael's inexplicable fear of Martin Madrazo. This one is particularly baffling when you analyze what we know about both characters. Let's put this in perspective. Michael DeSanta, formerly Michael Townley, is a legendary bank robber who has taken on corrupt government agencies, private military companies, and pulled off the biggest heist in Los Santos history. This is a guy who routinely engages in shootouts with small armies of heavily armed opponents and walks away unscathed. He's got connections with the FIB, access to military-grade weapons, and enough money to buy a small country after the Union Depository heist. Yet somehow this same Michael is supposedly terrified of a local crime boss who runs a relatively small operation in Los Santos. Madrazo isn't even the biggest fish in the criminal underworld. He's no triad, no Russian mafia boss, not even close to the level of organization that Merryweather has. He's essentially a glorified real estate fraudster with some muscle. The inconsistency becomes even more glaring when you look at what Michael actually does to Madrazo. He has no problem destroying Madrazo's house in a fit of rage early in the game. Later, Trevor literally kidnaps Madrazo's wife, and what are the consequences? Some angry phone calls? A demand for money that Michael could easily afford? That's it?
This is where the plot hole really opens up. If Madrazo was truly as dangerous as the game tries to make us believe, why didn't he retaliate more severely? And if he couldn't retaliate effectively, why was Michael so afraid of him in the first place? Michael has survived way worse than anything Madrazo could throw at him. Think about the resources at Michael's disposal. He's got Trevor, a literal one-man army who fears nothing and no one. He's got Franklin, one of the most skilled operators in Los Santos. He's got FIB connections that could make Madrazzo's life very difficult, not to mention the enormous wealth they accumulate throughout the game. The idea that Michael would live in fear of Madrazzo's retaliation makes absolutely no sense. The whole situation becomes even more absurd when you consider that Michael regularly takes on and defeats much more powerful enemies. He goes up against Merryweather, a private military company with global reach. He confronts corrupt federal agents with the power of the entire government behind them. Yet we're supposed to believe he's worried about a local crime boss who can't even keep his wife from being kidnapped. It feels like the writers needed Michael to be afraid of something to create tension, but they chose the wrong antagonist for it. Madrazo simply doesn't have the credibility as a threat to justify Michael's fear, especially given everything we know about Michael's capabilities and resources. What makes this plot hole even worse is that we never see Madrazo demonstrate any power that would justify this fear. He never shows that he has reach beyond his immediate territory, never displays any particularly impressive resources or connections. The game tells us he's scary without ever showing us why he should be scary to someone of Michael's caliber. In the end, this plot hole represents a serious disconnect between the character we're shown, a highly capable, well-connected criminal who takes on some of the most powerful organizations in the world, and the character's inexplicable fear of a relatively minor crime boss. It's a clear case of the narrative working against its own established logic, and it stands out as one of the more noticeable inconsistencies in GTA 5's storytelling. This fear of Madrazo might have made sense for a small-time criminal, but for Michael DeSanta, the guy who robs the biggest bank in the city and takes on private armies? It just doesn't add up, and it never will. Next, how Wade, who isn't exactly the sharpest tool in the shed, managed to track down Michael in Los Santos with seemingly minimal effort. Los Santos is a massive metropolitan area with millions of residents. Michael DeSanta is living under witness protection, meaning the FIB presumably set him up with a new identity, background documentation, and took precautions to hide his tracks. This is a guy who successfully stayed hidden from Trevor, one of the most determined individuals in the game, for nearly a decade. Yet somehow, Wade, yes, the same Wade who can barely string together a coherent sentence, finds him in what seems like a matter of days. The absurdity of this becomes even more apparent when you consider what this would actually involve. He'd need to search through a city of millions, identify someone living under a false identity, navigate complex property records and documentation, outsmart federal witness protection protocols. Do all this without any real investigative training or resources. What makes this plot hole even more glaring is that Wade's success completely undermines the FIB's competence. Are we supposed to believe that a professional government agency spent years protecting Michael's identity, only to have their entire operation cracked by Wade of all people? The same Wade who lives in a strip club and seems perpetually confused about basic facts. The game never properly explains how Wade accomplished this feat. There's no montage of clever detective work, no explanation of what resources or methods he used. He just somehow does it, defying all logic and probability. If finding Michael was this easy, why didn't any of his other enemies from his past life track him down before? This plot convenience becomes even more ridiculous when you consider that professional hitmen, other criminal organizations, and people with actual resources and motivation to find Michael never managed to locate him. Yet Wade, armed with apparently nothing but determination and Trevor's orders, succeeds where everyone else failed.
It's clearly a case where the writers needed Trevor to find Michael for the plot to progress, but they couldn't come up with a believable way to make it happen. So they just had Wade do it with no explanation, hoping players wouldn't think too hard about the logistics. But when you do think about it, it's one of those plot points that completely falls apart under scrutiny. The only way this would make sense is if Michael's witness protection was comically incompetent, or if he was deliberately easy to find, both of which contradict other elements of the story where his hidden identity is treated as a serious and well-maintained secret. It's a classic example of the writers sacrificing logic for plot convenience, and it stands as one of GTA 5's most obvious narrative shortcuts. Next, Franklin's willingness to kill Michael in one of the endings. This plot hole completely shatters character development and relationships built throughout the entire game. Let's look at Franklin and Michael's relationship. From the very beginning, Michael takes Franklin under his wing. He mentors him, teaches him the finer points of high-stakes crime, gets him out of the repo business, and helps him move up in the world. Michael is quite literally the reason Franklin goes from stealing cars in the hood to becoming a successful criminal mastermind. Their relationship is consistently portrayed as a genuine father-son dynamic, with Michael filling the void of the paternal figure Franklin never had. Throughout the game, we see countless moments where Franklin shows immense loyalty to Michael. He helps him with family problems, stands by him during the conflicts with Trevor, and repeatedly puts his life on the line for Michael's causes. Franklin even serves as a mediator between Michael and Trevor, often being the voice of reason trying to keep his mentor alive. This makes Franklin's potential decision to kill Michael absolutely nonsensical. The game tries to justify it with pressure from Devin Weston, but this falls completely flat. Franklin has stood up to bigger threats throughout the story. He's faced down corrupt federal agents, private military contractors, and various crime bosses. The idea that he would suddenly cave to Weston's pressure and kill his mentor makes zero sense. What makes this plot hole even more egregious is that Franklin has everything to lose and nothing to gain by killing Michael. He'd be throwing away his most valuable connection, his mentor, and someone who's proven to be a loyal friend. Not to mention, he'd be losing access to Michael's expertise and connections, all to please a corrupt billionaire who's proven himself untrustworthy multiple times. The game never provides a convincing motivation for this betrayal. If anything, all the character development points in the opposite direction. Franklin has repeatedly shown that he values loyalty and has criticized others for their betrayals. His sudden willingness to murder his mentor represents a complete departure from his established character traits. What's even more baffling is that Franklin is shown to be smart and strategic throughout the game. He would surely realize that killing Michael would likely put him in Trevor's crosshairs, and we all know how Trevor deals with betrayal. No sane person who knows Trevor would want to be on his bad side, especially not for someone like Devin Weston. The ending where Franklin kills Michael feels like it was forced in just to have a dark, alternative ending, rather than one that makes any sense for the characters involved. It's as if the writers forgot everything they had established about Franklin's character and his relationship with Michael, just to create artificial drama. This plot hole becomes even more apparent when you consider that Franklin has the option to take the Death Wish route instead, where he, Michael, and Trevor team up to eliminate their enemies. This option aligns perfectly with Franklin's character, his loyalty, and his intelligence. The fact that killing Michael is even presented as a viable choice for Franklin's character shows a fundamental disconnect in the game's writing. It's a classic case of forcing a character to act against their established nature and relationships just to create an alternative ending, and it stands as one of the most poorly justified character decisions in the entire game. The fact that players can choose this ending doesn't make it any less of a plot hole. It just highlights how badly it contradicts everything we know about Franklin's character. Next, Lester had zero idea about Trevor. He's portrayed as this all-knowing information broker who can hack into any system, track anyone down, and access virtually any database in existence. This is the same guy who can coordinate heists that involve hacking government facilities, manipulating the stock market, and tracking complex security systems. He's basically portrayed as a criminal mastermind with near unlimited access to information. Yet somehow, this same Lester had no idea that Trevor Phillips, one of his former crew members, was running a substantial criminal enterprise in Sandy Shores. Trevor wasn't exactly keeping a low profile. He was running a prominent meth business, engaging in regular conflicts with other gangs, making deals with various criminal organizations, operating a fairly well-known company called Trevor Phillips Enterprises, constantly causing chaos that made local news. This becomes even more ridiculous when you consider that Trevor wasn't even trying to hide. He was operating under his real name, in a fixed location, with a legitimate business front. He wasn't using any aliases or sophisticated cover stories. He was just being Trevor, loudly and publicly. The absurdity reaches new heights when you compare this to Wade's miraculous discovery of Michael. So Wade, who struggles with basic cognitive functions, can track down a man protected by the FIB in a city of millions. But Lester, with all his resources and capabilities, couldn't find Trevor, who was operating openly in a small desert town. What makes this plot hole even worse is that Lester maintains active connections in the criminal underworld. He's constantly getting information about potential scores, keeping tabs on criminal activities and monitoring various illegal operations. Yet somehow, Trevor's rather significant criminal operation never appeared on his radar? This inconsistency becomes even more glaring when you consider how quickly Lester gets back into working with Trevor once they do reconnect. He clearly knows Trevor's capabilities and seems unsurprised by his continued criminal activities. This suggests he should have been able to track Trevor's movements over the years. We're just supposed to accept that Lester, the man who can hack into government databases and track anyone anywhere, somehow missed the very public existence of his former associate who was making waves in the criminal world just a few hours' drive away. The only possible explanation would be that Lester deliberately avoided looking into Trevor's whereabouts. But even this doesn't hold up since Lester had no particular reason to avoid Trevor, unlike Michael, who was actively hiding from him. It's just another example of the writers sacrificing logical consistency for the sake of plot convenience. And we are done. Let me know in the comments, what do you think of these plot holes? Were they justified? Also subscribe to the channel and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.